One night, a Blackhawk helicopter and a passenger plane crossed paths over Washington, D.C. skies. What was supposed to be a routine flight turned into an unforeseen disaster. This tragedy was the result of a series of small mistakes and coincidences. What happened? How did it happen? All the details in the video. The night was calm over the Potomac River, the city lights of Washington, D.C. reflecting on the water below. Pilots and air traffic controllers worked in tandem, guiding aircraft safely through one of the most restricted airspaces in the world. But on this particular evening, an unforeseen disaster was about to unfold. At precisely 8:47 p.m., a U.S. Army Blackhawk helicopter, conducting a routine night training mission, collided midair with a regional jet. The impact sent shockwaves across the aviation world, leaving 67 people dead and authorities scrambling for answers. The suddenness of the event caught both civilian and military aviation experts off guard. Questions arose immediately. How could two aircraft, both under strict flight regulations, cross paths in such a catastrophic way? Reports indicated that the Blackhawk had been following a standard military training route, one commonly used for night operations. The crew aboard the helicopter were experienced pilots, trained for precision in high-risk environments. Simultaneously, American Airlines Flight 5342 was approaching Reagan National Airport, its passengers unaware of the tragedy looming just moments ahead. As emergency response teams rushed to the crash site, officials at the FAA and Department of Defense scrambled to assess what had gone wrong. Was it a miscommunication, a technical malfunction, or an unfortunate confluence of unpredictable factors? The coming investigation would have to uncover the truth behind one of the deadliest aviation disasters in Washington, D.C.'s history. Washington, D.C.'s airspace is among the most heavily controlled in the country. A 33-mile radius around the capital is designated as a special flight rules area, requiring advance clearance for all pilots. Inside this, a 17-mile restricted zone demands even stricter compliance. Despite these measures, the region remains congested with military, civilian, and governmental aircraft operating simultaneously. Pilots like retired Army officer Darrell Feller had long warned of the dangers, especially near the designated helicopter corridors over the Potomac River. That night, those very concerns turned into a grim reality. The problem lay in the complexity of overlapping flight paths. While civilian aircraft followed standard approach routes to Reagan National, military helicopters operated under their own set of guidelines, often flying at lower altitudes to avoid interference. The helicopter corridors, specifically designed to keep rotary wing aircraft separate from fixed-wing planes, were thought to be a sufficient safety measure. However, these corridors were not infallible, as the crash would tragically prove. Investigators would later determine that multiple risk factors played a role. The Blackhawk had been flying at a routine altitude, but changes in the regional jet's landing trajectory altered the expected course of events. Moreover, night conditions and ambient city lights created visual challenges for pilots. Even the most advanced aircraft can be subject to limitations in such conditions. What was supposed to be a routine approach to the airport instead became a high-stakes encounter that no one saw coming, until it was too late. The Blackhawk helicopter, flown by experienced military pilots, was following its designated southbound route over the Potomac. Meanwhile, American Airlines Flight 5342, a regional jet, was approaching Reagan National Airport. Originally assigned to land on runway 1, the flight was suddenly redirected to runway 33. This unexpected change required the aircraft to make a sharp turn, cutting directly across the helicopter's path at a critical altitude. The result was catastrophic. Flight data later revealed the Blackhawk had briefly risen above 300 feet, directly into the descent path of the jet. Air traffic controllers, who had a full view of both aircraft on their radar screens, made last-minute efforts to communicate with the pilots. However, at such high speeds and within such a narrow window of time, maneuvering options were extremely limited. The pilot of Flight 5342, likely focused on adjusting to the last-minute runway change, may not have spotted the Blackhawk in time. On the other side, the helicopter pilots, trained to operate at lower altitudes, would not have expected a commercial jetliner to suddenly alter its course directly into their flight path. Confusion reigned in those last few moments. Had the Blackhawk been flying just 100 feet lower, or had the regional jet maintained its original approach? disaster might have been avoided. The FAA's post-crash analysis would later reveal a chilling realization. This was a tragedy created not by one single failure, but by a perfect storm of minor miscalculations, all converging at the worst possible moment. As the two aircraft closed in, the city lights below created an optical illusion known as ground light confusion. The helicopter pilots, unable to distinguish the jet against the illuminated skyline, failed to take evasive action in time. Moments later, disaster struck. The impact sent debris raining down into the Potomac as emergency crews rushed to the scene. Eyewitnesses reported a fireball lighting up the night sky, followed by the chilling silence of an aircraft gone dark. The devastating loss of life sent shockwaves through the aviation community, raising serious questions about flight safety protocols. Emergency responders, trained for rapid deployment, arrived at the scene within minutes. Boats patrolled the river's surface while helicopters scanned the wreckage site with searchlights. Survivors were unlikely, given the force of the collision and the subsequent explosion. Rescue divers battled the freezing waters of the Potomac, retrieving what they could, as families and loved ones waited desperately for news. As news of the crash broke nationwide, aviation analysts were quick to point out systemic flaws in air traffic procedures. Some questioned whether the airspace regulations in Washington, D.C. were sufficient to prevent mid-air collisions. Others wondered if overworked air traffic controllers had inadvertently contributed to the incident by issuing the runway change. The answers would only come through a painstaking investigation that would take months to complete. In the wake of the tragedy, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed the nation, vowing a thorough investigation. There was an elevation issue, he admitted, promising that top-tier aviation experts would uncover the root cause to prevent a similar disaster. The FAA responded swiftly, imposing new restrictions on helicopter traffic in the area. Meanwhile, aviation experts debated whether the accident was a result of miscommunication, poor visibility, or an unpredictable confluence of both. As the nation mourned the loss of 67 souls, one thing became clear. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would shape the future of air travel safety in the nation's capital. As investigators combed through flight data, cockpit recordings, and radar logs, they attempted to recreate the final moments of both aircraft. One key question emerged. Could air traffic controllers have prevented the crash by maintaining the original landing approach for Flight 5342? Was the helicopter's altitude deviation significant enough to have contributed directly to the collision? Regulatory changes soon followed. The FAA announced revised protocols for runway reassignment procedures at Reagan National, ensuring that sudden changes would only be permitted under strict visibility conditions. Additionally, military training flights near the Potomac would undergo new altitude restrictions. The crash had exposed cracks in the system, cracks that authorities vowed to seal permanently. Even as reforms were enacted, the families of the victims sought closure. Memorial services were held, and names of those lost were etched into history. In the end, the tragedy of the Blackhawk crash was not just a story of loss, but a sobering reminder of the constant vigilance required to keep the skies safe for all who travel through them.